If a bond can be erased, why does it still know where your heart is? Rowan Hale had repeated that question to himself every night for the past 2 years, but today he was finally ready to learn the answer. The National Bond Restoration Institute stood on the highest hill overlooking New Avalon, its white marble walls reflecting the pale winter sunlight like polished ice. Every citizen in the Federation recognized the building because every Alpha and Omega understood what happened inside its silent halls. Bonds could be registered there, examined there, and under only the rarest legal circumstances, erased there. Rowan adjusted the collar of his charcoal grey coat as he stepped through the towering entrance, his silver blonde hair catching the light beneath the glass ceiling. The faint mark just below his neck remained hidden beneath a medical patch, but he could still feel it, warm and steady, as though it carried its own heartbeat. A beta receptionist greeted him with practiced professionalism before guiding him toward a secured elevator that descended beneath the institute. No advertisements decorated the walls. No comforting music played. Every detail reminded visitors that bond erasure was never considered routine medical care. It was treated as the final chapter of a life that could never return to what it had once been. Rowan signed the final authorization forms with steady hands despite the ache growing inside his chest. As an Omega, he knew the Federation required months of psychological evaluations before approving an erasure request, but his position as one of the nation's leading preservation specialists had granted him expedited review after years of documented separation from his Alpha. At least, that was what he believed. The technician welcomed him into a circular chamber illuminated by dozens of suspended crystal monitors that slowly rotated overhead. Each one displayed streams of biological data unique to Alpha and Omega bonds, patterns no ordinary relationship could ever produce. The technician offered one final warning. Once the sequence begins, your body may attempt to preserve the bond. That response is normal. Please remain calm. Rowan nodded quietly. I'm ready. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't seeking revenge. He simply wanted silence. 2 years earlier, Gideon Mercer had vanished from his life without explanation after saving him during a catastrophic terrorist attack that had nearly claimed hundreds of Omega lives. Their emergency bond had been created under extraordinary federal authorization, intended only to stabilize Rowan's condition until the crisis ended. Yet after Rowan recovered, Gideon disappeared behind layers of government secrecy. No calls. No letters. No explanation. Every official inquiry Rowan submitted had been rejected under national security classification. Eventually, he convinced himself the bond had never meant anything beyond survival. If that was true, then erasing it would simply allow both of them to move forward. The restraints around the medical chair activated automatically, securing only his wrists as required by Federation protocol. Thin rings of pale blue light surrounded the room while a transparent display counted down from 60 seconds. Rowan closed his eyes. He remembered the warmth of one impossible night beneath collapsing steel beams. He remembered hearing Gideon's calm voice telling him to keep breathing. He remembered waking days later to complete silence. Bond separation sequence initiated, the system announced. A soft vibration spread through the chamber. At first, nothing happened. Then the hidden mark beneath Rowan's collar pulsed with unexpected intensity. His breathing caught. Every monitor surrounding him flickered simultaneously before flashing crimson warning symbols. The calm voice of the computer changed instantly. Warning. Bond resistance exceeds expected parameters. Rowan opened his eyes just as a brilliant strand of silver light erupted across the chamber, stretching from his neck into empty space like an invisible thread refusing to break. Every machine began sounding alarms. Technicians rushed toward their control stations as biological readings climbed beyond recorded limits. One scientist whispered in disbelief. This shouldn't be possible. Hundreds of miles away, inside the towering headquarters of the Federal Bond Authority, Gideon Mercer stood before a conference table surrounded by senior officials discussing proposed reforms to Prime Alpha oversight. His expression remained as composed as ever, his black suit immaculate, his silver-grey eyes unreadable. No one noticed the faint glow beneath the collar of his uniform until the room's environmental sensors activated without warning. Every digital screen froze. Emergency lights flooded the chamber with crimson flashes. Gideon staggered a single step as the hidden bond mark across his neck blazed with unbearable heat. The carefully controlled alpha pheromone field surrounding him fractured instantly, triggering automated containment protocols designed for catastrophic bond emergencies. Reinforced steel barriers sealed every exit while emergency ventilation roared to life. The officials stared in stunned silence. Prime Alphas did not lose control. Not ever. Gideon slowly lifted one hand to his neck as memories he had spent 2 years burying crashed through every wall he had built around himself. One name echoed louder than every emergency alarm filling the building. Rowan. The alarms inside the National Bond Restoration Institute refused to quiet as technicians rushed between glowing consoles, their calm professionalism replaced by disbelief. Rowan remained seated while the silver strand connecting his bond mark to empty space shimmered brighter with every passing second. The chief medical officer stared at the readings before speaking into a secure communicator. Suspend the procedure immediately. The bond is rejecting separation. Rowan looked up, confused. I signed every approval. The review board cleared this months ago. The physician hesitated before answering. These biological responses should not exist if your file is accurate. Before Rowan could ask another question, the chamber lights dimmed and a sealed archive window appeared across the central display. Instead of medical charts, an authorization code flashed across the screen followed by a message that read, "Access restricted under Prime Federation statute." Every technician in the room exchanged uneasy glances. Rowan had spent years preserving historical government records, and he immediately recognized the classification level. Only matters involving National Alpha and Omega security received that designation. His bond was never supposed to fall into that category. Across the city, Gideon Mercer stood motionless inside the containment chamber as physicians confirmed that his biological readings were stabilizing, although no one could explain why they had spiked in the first place. The director of the Federal Bond Authority approached carefully. "Commander Mercer, should we notify the council?" Gideon lowered his hand from the glowing mark beneath his collar. "No." His voice remained calm, but his eyes revealed something the director had never seen before. Uncertainty. Find out who authorized a bond separation today. The director blinked. Do you believe the incident is connected? Gideon answered without hesitation. I know it is. His thoughts drifted backward to the day that had changed everything. 2 years earlier, New Avalon Central Station had been filled with commuters preparing for the holiday weekend when an extremist group released an experimental pheromone disruptor designed specifically to target unbonded omegas. Panic spread through the station as emergency systems failed to contain the invisible chemical cloud. Rowan had been trapped beneath a collapsed support beam after shielding 2 frightened children from falling debris. By the time Gideon arrived with the Federal Response Unit, Rowan's vital signs had become dangerously unstable. The attending physicians had delivered a grim conclusion. Without an emergency prime bond to regulate the Omega's collapsing biological rhythm, he would not survive transport to a hospital. Federal law allowed temporary bond authorization only during extraordinary disasters, and Gideon accepted the responsibility without hesitation. The ceremony lasted less than 2 minutes. There were no witnesses beyond emergency medical staff and government officials. The bond existed only to preserve life. Nothing more. Or at least that was what Gideon believed. Rowan remembered waking several days later inside a secure recovery ward. The bond mark rested quietly against his neck, proof that someone had saved him. Nurses assured him Commander Mercer would visit after completing emergency operations. He waited through another sunrise. Then another. Instead, 2 government representatives entered his room carrying sealed documents explaining that all information concerning the prime bond had been classified indefinitely. Every request to contact Gideon was denied. Every question ended with the same rehearsed answer. National security required complete separation. Months passed before Rowan finally accepted that he had simply been left behind. Back inside the institute, the emergency shutdown completed successfully, yet the glowing strand between Rowan and the invisible distance refused to disappear. One elderly technician studied the phenomenon before quietly whispering, "This is not a temporary rescue bond." Rowan turned toward him. "What does that mean?" The technician looked at the classified warning still covering the main display and slowly shook his head. "It means someone has hidden the truth from both of you, and whatever this bond truly is, it was never meant to be erased." Rowan could not stop staring at the classified warning suspended above the silent medical chamber as the technicians quietly disconnected the remaining diagnostic equipment. Every official in the room suddenly avoided eye contact, as though simply acknowledging the message could place their careers at risk. The elderly technician who had spoken moments earlier stepped closer and lowered his voice. "There is only one person I trust to help you understand this, and she works outside the Federation archives now." He discreetly slid a small paper card across the examination table before another physician called his name. Printed on the card were only 3 words, "Iris Quinn, attorney." Before Rowan could ask another question, the technician walked away without looking back. Less than an hour later, Rowan left the institute through a side entrance normally reserved for staff. Snow drifted across the sidewalks of New Avalon while reporters gathered outside the main gate, unaware of the classified emergency hidden beneath the building. Rowan pulled his coat tighter and made his way toward an older section of the city where Iris Quinn maintained a modest legal office overlooking the river. Unlike the polished towers occupied by government agencies, her building had once served as a courthouse before being converted into independent offices. Shelves filled with worn legal volumes surrounded Iris as she welcomed Rowan inside. She was a beater whose calm expression reflected years spent challenging powerful institutions through patience instead of force. The moment Rowan mentioned the Bond Restoration Institute, Iris quietly locked the office door and activated a privacy field that prevented electronic surveillance. "Tell me everything," she said. Rowan explained the failed separation, the classified warning, and the technician's final words. Iris listened without interrupting. When he finished, she disappeared into a back room and returned carrying a weathered storage case sealed with obsolete government markings. "This file was scheduled for destruction 15 years ago," she explained. "Someone rescued it before the order was carried out." She carefully opened the case and revealed dozens of handwritten records predating the Federation's modern digital archive. At the center rested an ancient legal charter titled the Prime Bond Preservation Act. Rowan recognized the historical seal immediately. The law had existed long before modern bond medicine. Iris turned several pages until she found the section she wanted. "Listen carefully," she said. "Most citizens believe prime alpha bonds exist only because of extraordinary compatibility. That is not the complete truth." She pointed toward a faded paragraph describing an almost mythical genetic classification known as an anchor omega. According to the original law, an anchor omega possessed an exceptionally rare biological signature capable of stabilizing the neurological balance of a prime alpha without suppressing either individual's free will. Because prime alphas carried genetic traits considered essential to national security, every confirmed anchor omega had historically been placed under strict government protection. Rowan frowned. "Protection sounds generous." Iris gave a quiet, knowing smile. "Governments often choose comforting words for complicated realities." She continued reading. "If an anchor omega bond was forcibly dissolved after reaching full synchronization, both individuals could experience severe neurological instability, unpredictable memory disruption, and permanent damage to the bond network itself." Rowan slowly lowered the document, struggling to absorb the implications. If this law still exists, why has no one ever heard of it? Iris answered immediately. Because several administrations spent decades rewriting bond history after deciding the public would never accept that certain omegas possessed legal rights the government could not fully control. Across the city, Gideon sat alone inside his secured office while confidential reports streamed across multiple monitors. Every search returned the same result. Rowan Hale's bond separation request had been approved through channels that should have required unanimous authorization from the High Council. Someone had bypassed safeguards designed specifically to prevent this exact situation. Gideon opened one final encrypted file containing the emergency authorization signed 2 years earlier after the station disaster. As hidden pages unfolded across the screen, his expression changed for the first time. The temporary rescue bond described in every official report had never existed. Instead, the original medical assessment identified Rowan as a confirmed Anchor Omega, and the bond formed that day had become permanent the moment their biological signatures synchronized. Before Gideon could continue reading, the file abruptly disappeared. A single notification replaced every document. Access revoked by order of Senator Magnus Voss. Gideon stared at the name in complete silence, finally realizing that the truth had not simply been hidden from Rowan. It had been carefully hidden from him as well. Rowan left Iris Quinn's office carrying copies of documents that legally should not have existed, yet every page felt heavier than the last. The afternoon sky had turned grey, and the first layer of fresh snow softened the sounds of New Avalon as people hurried home. Without realizing that a secret capable of reshaping the Federation had quietly resurfaced. Anchor Omega. The words echoed through Rowan's thoughts with every step. He had spent his entire career preserving forgotten records, but he had never imagined that the greatest erased history would be his own. His communicator vibrated. It was Noah Ellery. "Where are you?" Every news channel is talking about an emergency at the Federal Bond Authority. Rowan immediately opened the public broadcast. A polished anchor reported that an unexpected biological containment protocol had briefly interrupted a high-level government meeting. Officials insisted there had been no danger to the public. Before the segment ended, another headline appeared beneath it. The Federation had temporarily suspended all bond separation procedures pending an internal investigation. Rowan felt his stomach tighten. Someone had already begun rewriting the story. At the Federal Bond Authority, Gideon Mercer stood inside a secure operations center reviewing satellite maps, transportation records, and encrypted communication logs. Several officers waited for instructions, expecting a large-scale enforcement operation. Instead, Gideon issued only one order. Locate Rowan Hale before anyone else does. He is not to be treated as a suspect. He is under my personal protection. The officers exchanged uncertain glances. Prime Alpha Authority carried enormous legal weight, yet within minutes an even higher priority directive arrived from the Senate Oversight Committee. Senator Magnus Voss appeared on every official screen with calm confidence. "Commander Mercer," he said, "the Council appreciates your concern, but intelligence suggests Rowan Hale may possess classified biological material connected to national security. Effective immediately, the Senate will assume jurisdiction." Gideon's expression remained unreadable. "On what legal basis?" Magnus smiled politely. "Preventive custody. The public cannot be allowed to panic." The transmission ended before Gideon could respond. Moments later another notification appeared across every government network. A carefully prepared public statement claimed that an unidentified Omega had illegally attempted to destroy a protected prime bond, placing government stability at risk. Within an hour social media exploded with speculation. Some accused the mysterious Omega of recklessness. Others insisted Prime Alphas had finally begun forcing permanent bonds upon unwilling Omegas. Neither version resembled the truth, yet both spread with astonishing speed. Rowan watched the headlines from a quiet coffee shop as strangers debated the story around him. None of them knew his name, but he recognized how quickly public opinion could become its own prison. Iris arrived carrying another folder and sat across from him. "Magnus is moving faster than I expected," she said. "He does not want the real law uncovered." Rowan looked up. "If Gideon knows the truth now, why has he not contacted me?" Before Iris could answer, every display inside the cafe switched to a live government announcement. Gideon appeared before reporters outside the Federal Bond Authority. Cameras captured his composed expression while dozens of questions filled the air. One journalist shouted, "Commander Mercer, are you searching for the Omega involved in today's incident?" Gideon answered without hesitation. "Yes." Another reporter immediately asked, "Will that Omega be detained?" Gideon paused just long enough for the silence to become unforgettable. "I intend to find Rowan Hale before those who are willing to misuse the law do." The statement lasted only seconds before officials ended the broadcast, but it was already too late. Millions had heard Rowan's name for the first time. Magnus quietly watched the same broadcast from his Senate office and smiled. He turned toward an assistant waiting beside an illuminated wall map marked with secure laboratories scattered across the country. "Prepare the recovery teams," he said calmly. "If Commander Mercer reaches the Anchor Omega first, everything we have built over the last decade will disappear." Outside, snow continued falling across New Avalon while Rowan realized that running from Gideon was no longer the greatest danger. Someone far more powerful had already transformed the truth into a weapon, and every road ahead was beginning to close. By sunrise the next morning, Rowan Hale no longer felt like a private citizen. Every screen across New Avalon displayed carefully edited reports describing an unidentified biological security threat while avoiding the facts that truly mattered. Iris Quinn insisted they leave the city before Senator Magnus Voss tightened his control over the investigation. Noah Ellery volunteered his apartment as a temporary refuge, believing that an ordinary residential building would attract less attention than a hotel or government-safe house. Rowan appreciated the loyalty, but the uneasy warmth lingering around his fading bond mark reminded him that time was no longer on his side. Every few hours the mark pulsed with a faint silver glow, as if responding to someone far away. At the Federal Bond Authority, Gideon Mercer rejected repeated orders to surrender command of the search operation. His senior officers watched in silence as confidential files continued disappearing from secure databases. Every erased document pointed toward the same conclusion. Someone inside the Senate had spent years removing historical evidence related to Anchor Omegas and Prime bonds. Gideon requested access to archived laboratory reports only to receive another denial signed by Senator Magnus Voss. Instead of backing down, he quietly instructed a trusted analyst to recover deleted records through offline backups that had never been connected to the central network. Hours later the analyst returned with a single surviving file that had escaped destruction because it had been stored inside a disconnected research vault. The report described an experimental initiative known only as the Artificial Bond Program. The project claimed it could extract biological resonance from naturally synchronized alpha and omega bonds and reproduce the pattern inside synthetic crystals. If successful, those artificial bonds could influence compatibility testing, social placement, and eventually every legal bond registration across the Federation. Gideon slowly lowered the report. He finally understood why Rowan had become a target. This was never about one bond. It was about controlling every future bond. Meanwhile, Iris arranged a confidential meeting with a retired Federation scientist who had once supervised bond preservation research before resigning under mysterious circumstances. The elderly researcher welcomed them into a secluded greenhouse on the outskirts of the city where rare medicinal plants filled the air with a calming natural fragrance that masked biological signatures from standard surveillance equipment. After carefully examining Rowan's medical records, the scientist quietly confirmed Iris's fears. "Your bond did not resist separation because it was emotionally strong," he explained. "It resisted because its biological structure has become a living reference model. Someone has been studying it for years." Rowan looked up in disbelief. "Without my knowledge?" The scientist nodded. "Every examination you completed after the station disaster supplied additional information. You believed you were attending routine medical evaluations. In reality, your bond was becoming the foundation for artificial bond replication." Before anyone could speak again, every light inside the greenhouse flickered. A nearby communications panel activated automatically with an emergency government alert requesting citizens to report Rowan Hale's location immediately. The scientist sighed. "They found us sooner than I expected." Outside, several unmarked government vehicles quietly surrounded the property. Their occupants wore official security uniforms, but none displayed the insignia of the Federal Bond Authority. Iris immediately recognized the difference. "Those are Senate Recovery Division teams," she whispered. "They answer only to Magnus." Rowan looked through the greenhouse glass and noticed portable equipment unlike anything used during ordinary law enforcement operations. Instead of restraints or medical supplies, the teams unloaded insulated containers lined with glowing crimson crystals that resembled unfinished bond matrices. The retired scientist's expression darkened. "Those are resonance collectors," he said softly. If they activate those devices near a synchronized anchor bond, they can harvest biological patterns directly from the surrounding field. At that exact moment, Gideon's encrypted communicator finally reached Rowan's secure device after hours of interference. Only one sentence appeared on the screen. "Do not let them bring you to a laboratory." Rowan read the message twice before looking back toward the approaching recovery teams, realizing that Senator Magnus Voss had never intended to protect the Federation. He intended to capture the only living bond capable of completing the artificial bond program, and Rowan himself had unknowingly become the final piece missing from a project hidden beneath the law for more than a decade. The retired scientist reacted with remarkable calm despite the growing tension outside the greenhouse. He reached beneath a workbench and activated an old mechanical switch that released a concealed passage leading into a narrow service corridor built decades before the surrounding neighborhood even existed. This escape route was originally designed to protect classified research during natural disasters, he explained. Today it may protect something far more important. Iris motioned for Rowan and Noah to move quickly while the first voices echoed outside the greenhouse walls. They hurried through the dim passage until they emerged several blocks away near the abandoned botanical archives. Snow continued falling, covering their tracks almost as quickly as they appeared. Rowan glanced at the secure communicator still resting in his hand. Gideon's warning remained on the screen, unchanged, yet seeing those words stirred emotions he had spent 2 years trying to bury. If Gideon truly wanted to protect him, then why had he disappeared without a single explanation after the station disaster? The question remained unanswered, but for the first time Rowan realized someone else might have written that silence for both of them. Across the city, Gideon had not slept since the failed bond separation. Every passing hour brought new neurological reports from Federation physicians, each one more troubling than the last. They confirmed that the instability created by the interrupted bond erasure was no longer temporary. Prime alpha neurological synchronization had begun to fluctuate beyond established medical expectations. The physicians urged Gideon to enter mandatory observation, but he refused. He insisted on remaining at his command center until Rowan was safe. By late afternoon, however, subtle changes became impossible to ignore. Gideon paused in front of a digital operations map, studying familiar districts that suddenly seemed strangely unfamiliar. One of his officers asked whether they should expand the search perimeter. Gideon looked toward the young Alpha with quiet confusion before answering, "Remind me, which district is Rowan living in now?" The room fell silent. His officers exchanged worried glances because Gideon had personally approved every search location only hours earlier. A physician standing nearby immediately requested another neurological assessment. The results revealed what everyone feared. The synchronized bond collapse had begun affecting Gideon's memory pathways. Long-term strategic knowledge remained intact, but recent personal memories were becoming fragmented. Even so, one detail refused to disappear. Every time the physicians asked what he remembered most clearly, Gideon answered without hesitation. Rowan. Meanwhile, Iris guided Rowan into a secure archive maintained by independent legal historians beyond direct government control. Hidden beneath shelves of preserved legislative records rested an encrypted storage crystal recovered from a former High Council administrator. After several careful authentication steps, the crystal finally revealed an unedited transcript recorded only days after the station disaster 2 years earlier. Rowan listened in complete silence as familiar voices filled the small archive room. A physician confirmed that the emergency bond had permanently synchronized because Rowan had tested positive as an anchor omega. Another official warned that informing either participant immediately could expose the existence of the Prime Bond Preservation Act before the Senate completed its legislative revisions. Then a final voice, unmistakably belonging to Senator Magnus Voss, delivered the order that changed everything. Separate them completely. Commander Mercer will return to active federal service under confidentiality restrictions. Rowan Hale will receive standard recovery protocols. Neither individual is to receive further contact without Senate authorization. The recording ended. Rowan remained perfectly still, staring at the silent crystal resting in Iris's hands. Every unanswered question from the last 2 years suddenly aligned into one painful truth. Gideon had not abandoned him by choice. They had both been deliberately isolated so that their bond could be studied while neither understood its real significance. Noah quietly placed a reassuring hand on Rowan's shoulder without speaking. There was nothing anyone could say to erase 2 years of unnecessary loneliness. At that same moment, inside the Federal Bond Authority medical wing, Gideon struggled to remember the names of several senior officials standing around his hospital bed. Their faces blurred together, but when he noticed the faded emergency bracelet still stored inside a sealed evidence case beside his belongings, a gentle smile crossed his face. He remembered exactly where it had come from. It belonged to the frightened Omega he had promised would never face the future alone, and although much of the world around him had begun slipping into uncertainty, that promise remained brighter than every fading memory. Rowan did not sleep that night. The recording he had heard inside the hidden archive replayed endlessly in his mind, replacing 2 years of resentment with something far more complicated. Every unanswered letter, every rejected request, every lonely birthday, and every quiet evening spent convincing himself that Gideon had chosen duty over him suddenly carried a different meaning. Neither of them had been free to decide anything. They had both become pieces on a board controlled by people who viewed bonds as political assets instead of living promises. As dawn broke over New Avalon, Iris spread several maps across a large wooden table. Independent journalists, retired legal scholars, and trusted former government employees had begun contacting her after Gideon's public statement. The truth was creating small cracks inside a system that had seemed impossible to challenge only days earlier. Magnus will move quickly, Iris said. If he secures the artificial bond research before we expose it, he can destroy every remaining piece of evidence. Noah looked toward Rowan. What do we do? Rowan stared silently at the maps before answering. For 2 years I wanted only one thing. I wanted to erase the bond and walk away. Now I finally understand that running away will not protect anyone. He paused before continuing with steady determination. I am done letting other people decide what my bond means. Across the city, Gideon insisted on leaving the medical wing despite repeated objections from Federation physicians. His memory continued to fluctuate in subtle ways. He occasionally struggled to recall recent meetings or the names of officials who had worked beside him for years, yet every time someone mentioned Rowan, his attention became perfectly clear. The physicians explained that the unstable synchronization could continue until the bond either recovered naturally or collapsed completely. Gideon listened without interrupting before asking only one question. How much time do we have? No one answered immediately. Finally the senior physician admitted, we do not know. Gideon quietly stood, fastened his uniform jacket, and walked toward the exit. Then we cannot waste another hour. Guided by information recovered through Iris's confidential network, Rowan and the others traveled toward an abandoned federal research complex hidden beyond the northern edge of the city. Officially the facility had been closed after budget reductions nearly a decade earlier. In reality, shipping records revealed that specialized laboratory equipment had continued arriving there under Senate authorization until only a few weeks earlier. As they approached from a wooded hillside, Rowan noticed several modern transport vehicles parked near the underground entrance. Through a break in the trees, he caught sight of technicians carefully moving large transparent containers filled with glowing crimson crystals. Even from a distance, the crystals emitted faint pulses that caused the mark beneath Rowan's collar to react uncomfortably. The retired scientist's warning returned immediately. Those were resonance collectors built to imitate living bond structures. Iris handed Rowan a small encrypted storage device containing every recovered document, transcript, and legal record exposing the Prime Bond Preservation Act and the Artificial Bond Program. If something happens, she said quietly, this evidence must survive. Rowan closed his hand around the device before looking back toward the hidden laboratory. He finally understood that exposing the truth alone would not stop Magnus. The research itself had to disappear before it could ever be completed. At that same moment, Gideon's vehicle arrived on the opposite side of the facility after tracing encrypted Senate transportation routes hidden inside archived logistics records. His security officers prepared tactical equipment, expecting formal orders before advancing. Instead, Gideon looked toward the underground entrance with calm certainty. No one enters that laboratory unless it is to protect the people inside. One officer hesitated before asking, including Rowan Hale. Gideon's answer came without even a second of hesitation. Especially Rowan. Meanwhile, Rowan made his own decision. He handed the storage device back to Iris. If I stay hidden, Magnus will keep chasing me and this project will continue somewhere else. If I go inside willingly, I can stop it where it began. Noah immediately objected, but Rowan gently shook his head. 2 years ago my bond was created because someone chose to save my life. Today I finally have the chance to choose something for myself. Without waiting for anyone to argue further, Rowan stepped out from the cover of the trees and walked toward the laboratory entrance, not because the bond demanded it, not because the government expected it, and not because fear left him no other option, but because for the first time since the station disaster, every step belonged entirely to his own decision. Rowan walked through the open laboratory entrance with steady steps, refusing to let uncertainty slow him down. The underground facility looked nothing like the abandoned research center described in public. Records. Bright white corridors stretched beneath the mountainside, leading toward enormous laboratories filled with transparent chambers where crimson bond crystals floated inside carefully controlled environments. Engineers and technicians stopped working the moment Rowan entered, their surprised expressions revealing that none of them had expected him to arrive willingly. At the center of the largest chamber stood Senator Magnus Voss, impeccably dressed and completely composed. He smiled with quiet satisfaction. "Thank you for saving us valuable time," he said. "History often remembers the people who resist change, but it is built by those willing to make necessary sacrifices." Rowan met his gaze without hesitation. "You are not protecting the future. You are trying to control it." Magnus calmly gestured toward the glowing crystal array surrounding them. "Control is an unpleasant word. Stability is more accurate. Every year thousands of Alpha and Omega citizens struggle because compatibility remains unpredictable. Artificial bonds would eliminate uncertainty forever. Families would be matched with scientific precision. Careers could be planned. Society would become stronger." Rowan slowly shook his head. "A bond chosen by a government is not a bond. It is obedience." Before Magnus could respond, emergency lights illuminated the laboratory as security systems detected unauthorized arrivals above ground. Gideon Mercer and a small team of Federal Bond Authority officers entered through a secondary access corridor after presenting emergency constitutional authority that temporarily suspended Senate control over the facility. The laboratory staff froze as two branches of government confronted one another without raising their voices. Gideon stepped forward, his expression calm despite the visible exhaustion surrounding him. His recent memory continued to fade in small fragments, yet the moment his eyes found Rowan, quiet certainty replaced every trace of confusion. Magnus folded his hands behind his back. "Commander Mercer, you are arriving too late. The research has already been completed." Gideon answered evenly. "No. It has only been hidden." Iris Quinn entered moments later accompanied by independent legal observers and investigative journalists who had followed encrypted evidence transmitted from the archive. Noah had already released authenticated copies of the Prime Bond Preservation Act, the concealed medical reports, and the recorded Senate orders to multiple news organizations across the Federation, ensuring that no single institution could suppress the truth again. Live broadcasts began appearing on monitors throughout the laboratory as reporters confirmed the authenticity of the recovered documents. Citizens across the country watched historians explain that Anchor Omegas had been deliberately erased from public records and that Senate officials had concealed permanent prime bonds for political purposes. Magnus remained composed until another screen displayed financial records connecting confidential Senate funding to the artificial bond program. The silence inside the laboratory grew heavier than any accusation. Several researchers quietly lowered their identification badges, realizing the project they believed would improve society had been built upon deception instead of informed consent. Gideon walked toward the central control console where the resonance collectors remained active. He studied the operating system before turning to Rowan. If these collectors remain online, the research can always be recreated. Rowan understood immediately. Without hesitation, he accessed the preservation protocols he knew so well from years of restoring historical archives. Rather than damaging the laboratory, he initiated a complete legal evidence lockdown that permanently encrypted every research file while transferring authenticated copies directly to the Federal Judicial Repository, where they could no longer be altered or secretly exploited. The glowing crimson crystal network gradually powered down until only ordinary white illumination remained. The room felt strangely peaceful for the first time. Magnus looked around as decades of carefully protected secrecy dissolved before his eyes. Federal investigators formally relieved him of oversight authority pending judicial review, and no one objected. Outside the facility, crowds gathered peacefully as news spread across the Federation. Thousands of Alpha, Omega, and Beta citizens stood together holding candles beneath the falling snow, not to celebrate one victory over another, but to support a future where bonds would belong to the people living them rather than the institutions attempting to define them. Rowan looked toward Gideon, who smiled with quiet relief despite the uncertainty that still lingered in his fading memories. For the first time since the station disaster, the bond between them was no longer being shaped by hidden laws or secret orders. Its future would finally be decided in the open, where truth had become stronger than fear. 1 year later, the first day of spring arrived with clear skies over New Avalon, and the city felt different in ways that could not be measured by new buildings or rewritten laws alone. The Federation had adopted the Bond Freedom Act after months of public hearings, independent scientific review, and open debate. Every Alpha, Omega, and Beta now possessed equal legal authority to decide whether a bond would begin, continue, or end, provided that informed consent remained at the center of every decision. The forgotten history of the Anchor Omegas had become part of every university curriculum, while the Prime Bond Preservation Act had been placed inside the National Museum as a reminder that even well-intentioned laws could become dangerous when hidden from the people they affected. Senator Magnus Voss had been removed from public office after the investigation revealed years of unauthorized secrecy surrounding the artificial bond program. The laboratories once dedicated to synthetic bond research had been transformed into public medical centers focused on voluntary bond health, counseling, and scientific transparency. Rowan Hale walked through the restored National Bond Archive, no longer as a preservation specialist working quietly behind locked doors but as the newly appointed director of the Federation Institute for Bond Rights. Every day he welcomed Alpha, Omega, and Beta families searching for answers rather than permissions. Instead of protecting secrets, the archive now preserved truth. Nearby, Noah Ellie coordinated educational programs teaching young citizens about the history that had almost disappeared forever, while Iris Quinn continued leading legal reforms that ensured no future administration could erase constitutional protections without public oversight. Gideon Mercer had resigned from his position as commander of the Federal Bond Authority shortly after the reforms became law. His recovery had been gradual. Some memories from the months surrounding the failed bond separation never fully returned, yet the physicians eventually confirmed that the neurological instability had stopped progressing once the constant political pressure surrounding the bond disappeared. Rowan often smiled at the strange irony that Gideon sometimes forgot the names of restaurants they had visited together, yet he never once forgot to arrive at the archive every Friday afternoon carrying 2 cups of coffee prepared exactly the way Rowan liked. Certain memories lived beyond ordinary recall. On one quiet afternoon they returned together to the same white ceremonial chamber inside the National Bond Restoration Institute where Rowan had once attempted to erase the bond that had brought so much confusion into both of their lives. The room had changed. The warning signs emphasizing government authority had been replaced with simple words reminding every visitor that choice belonged to the individual standing inside. A senior medical counselor greeted them warmly before asking the only question that truly mattered. "Are both of you here by your own free decision?" Rowan looked toward Gideon. There were no hidden officials behind observation glass, no classified files, and no secret orders waiting beyond locked doors. Gideon met Rowan's eyes with the same quiet steadiness that had first inspired trust beneath the collapsing station years before. "Yes," he answered. Rowan smiled before giving the same answer. This time no one hurried them. The counselor explained every option with complete transparency, including the choice to leave without changing anything. After listening carefully, Rowan reached for Gideon's hand. "The bond we carry was created because circumstances left us no choice," he said softly. "What I want today is not to restore the past. I want to choose our future." Gideon nodded, his expression filled with calm gratitude. "Then let us begin again." As the new voluntary bond ceremony gently activated, the old unstable resonance faded into a warm silver glow unlike anything recorded in historical archives. It was not brighter because it was stronger. It was steadier because it belonged entirely to two people who understood its meaning. Outside the institute, sunlight reflected across the city as countless citizens continued living lives shaped by freedom rather than fear. Rowan realized that the greatest change had never been the new laws, the public trials, or the rewritten history books. The greatest victory was far simpler. No Alpha or Omega would ever again have to wonder whether their future had already been decided by someone else before they were given the chance to choose it for themselves. What would you have done if you were in this situation? Tell us in the comments. If you love Alpha and Omega stories filled with passion, loyalty, heartbreak, and second chances, please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.